Hello there, my name is Dylan, and today's review is going to be Massive Darkness. If you are looking to replace any of these games, Imperial Assault, Sword and Sorcery, Shadows of Brimstone, I'm going to tell you right now that Massive Darkness is absolutely the game that will make you move phase. Well, actually, they're going to stay exactly right where they are. So I think the first question on your mind now is that Simon's new game a big giant flop? I'm going to say no. And I think a lot of the criticism that's come out about Massive Darkness is largely because people were expecting the next big dungeon crawler. And I'm going to be kind of on the team of that this game isn't really a dungeon crawler. Whoa, you say. But there's dungeon tiles. I level up my character. I get lots of loot. And I kill lots of things and some really cool bosses. Isn't that just a dungeon crawler? Sure, Massive Darkness does share a lot of similarities with all those dungeon crawlers. But Massive Darkness is kind of different in that really it's all about just killing as much as you can and getting as much loot as you possibly can. Now this should remind you of another game, not a board game, but a computer game. And in fact, here's the thing. Quest 10, this guy is the final boss. And he looks a lot like this guy. In fact, I think they might even be cousins. So just like Diablo, Massive Darkness has a bunch of mobs of creatures which you are just going to mow down as quickly as possible to get loot from a boss. Then there's these big wandering monsters that are kind of like the name creatures in Diablo that you really want to kill, also for more loot, and just to say that you did. And it's actually pretty easy to kill most of these things. It's not the most challenging game on the market, but then again, neither is Diablo, at least not at the lower difficulties. I think this similarity to Diablo is caused by being built on Guillotine Games' other big game, Zombicide. In Zombicide, you wander around a city or, a medieval city, and you just slaughter hordes and hordes and hordes of zombies. This is kind of endless. Now, Massive Darkness does differ in that those hordes aren't quite endless, but nonetheless, they can be quite numerous. Massive Darkness does share a lot of similarities with Zombicide. The way movement works, the way the tiles look, the way combat kind of happens, the way equipment looks. Certain things are relatively similar, but there's some key differences in the game. Probably one of the first major differences you will notice is that each hero has their own skill. And then beyond that, you're going to choose a class to pair that hero with. Now each hero has a suggested class that they work with best, but there is no restrictions to classes. So you could have a barbarian who wields magic, or you could have a wizard who charges in the fray like a berserker. And this can be kind of fun to just try out different heroes with different skill sets and just see how they work or how they don't work. So let's get to that big question. Is Massive Darkness a good or bad game? And I think it's just going to depend on what group you're part of. Some groups are going to love this game, and other groups are going to absolutely despise it. If you're part of that group that's looking for a really satisfying sort of dungeon crawl experience, Massive Darkness is not that game. You level up extremely fast. What skills you choose aren't necessarily that important because you're going to get another one very quickly. They can be somewhat important moment to moment, but overall they're not really that important because you're going to have all of them or most of them by the time you finish the quest. What loot you get doesn't really matter because everybody can use magic, everybody can use hammers, everybody can use an axe, everybody can use a two-handed. It may or may not combo very well with your class, but at least you can use it until you get a better one, or you can just transmute it and get more loot that's a higher level, and hopefully that's even better than what you had before. Now, if you're part of the other crowd, and this is where this game succeeds a lot for me, is that it is a lighter game, not quite heavy, I would say somewhere in the medium range of sort of difficulty of learning the rules and how complicated it is, but for the most part it's pretty straightforward. You can explain the rules to anyone pretty easily. And I think that is great because this is the kind of game that just looks awesome. There's a ton of sweet, awesome looking miniatures. You roll a lot of dice. The excitement of just rushing into a mob or opening a door and learning that, oh, I've made a horrible mistake, but let's just see if we can get through this, or just, trying new things and just having fun with it. That's really what this game is about, just having fun. And that succeeds for me in that way because This is the kind of game I can bring to my coworkers at work, or friends that I haven't seen in a while, or just sort of new board game people, and introduce them to the world of board games. And they're going to see this game, they're going to think, wow, this is really cool, I would like to learn this. And then, from there, then they can dive into those more satisfying, more critical thinking type games, Imperial Assault, or Sword and Sorcery, or Shadows of Brimstone. Those kinds of games, it's going to instantly click with them, but at least they get a nice stepping stone into this world. And there's a lot of hooks in this game. There's running into a giant mob and learning that, boom, you roll all your dice and you can defeat every single one of them except for the boss in one hit. And that's really satisfying if you get to manage to do that. Or just finding a really cool fire sword when you needed it, or ice sword when you really needed it, and then you can dual wield them both and just slash those enemies to death, and just all sorts of really cool little tiny moments. And not only that, watching those miniatures move on the board and just look around, it just looks really awesome. And especially if you're part of my generation, aka the millennial generation, where our attention spans are basically the
squirrel.
Massive of Darkness has really short, sort of easy to understand rules. There are some rules that are a little wonky, like line of sight and where monsters can move depending on where heroes are, but for the most part it's pretty straightforward. Maybe one person in your entire group needs to kind of know how the monster AI really works in an in-depth way, but for the most part everybody else just needs to know that you do several actions on your turn, you roll a bunch of dice, and then let's see what the results are. A lot of Massive Darkness gameplay really revolves around those little moments and sort of the decisions you make based upon them. Do we stand our ground against this giant horde, or do we dash towards the exit and get out of this dungeon as fast as we can? Do we fight the wandering monster coming towards us, or run away from it and hide? Do I transmute these really good gear that seems to be working well for me and try to get an even better one? Now yes, none of those decisions are necessarily earth-shattering. They're not exactly hard decisions, nor are they necessarily going to change the game any one way all that much. But with those types of decisions, Massive Darkness becomes this really kind of nice, light, medium game, as I was saying. And the nice thing about that is it kind of avoids having an alpha gamer. Now, obviously, if there's a personality out there that is always an alpha gamer, that'll just happen anyways. But for the most part, it's pretty easy for everyone to make their own decisions. They're not going to need other people to really tell them what's the best decision, because sometimes you never know what the best decision is going to be. Dice roll can make one decision that seems bad really good all of a sudden. Now, does this mean that Massive Darkness is kind of one of the greatest light, medium weight games you're going to find out there, especially for sort of that semi-dungeon crawler feel? It's debatable. I heavily enjoy Massive Darkness, and I do think it is a pretty good game. It may even hit my top 10 of the year, maybe on the lower end of that. I haven't obviously really compiled that list yet, but I enjoy it a lot. That being said, there definitely are some problems with the game. In fact, if you play with less than, I would say, 4 heroes, 1 to 3 heroes, the game is pretty darn easy. While unlike Zombicide, Guillotine Games here did attempt to do some form of scaling, it doesn't really work that great for lower hero numbers. Somewhere between 4 to 6 tends to work best, and that's largely because they scaled everything, but they didn't scale loot. So when you have less heroes, they just have tons and tons of loot, which means they can transmute all they want and get to really high level gear a lot quicker than when you're playing with 6 heroes and there's still the same amount of loot, but you have to divide it up so everybody can at least contribute something towards combat. Because sometimes when you don't have enough loot like that, it gets really hard, because there's somebody out there with still like a level 1 sword and they do no damage to the mobs that are now level 2, maybe even level 3. That being said too, also the base game enemies aren't terribly interesting. The dwarves, goblins, and orcs are okay, but they don't do a whole lot of special ability type stuff. They're not necessarily all that interesting. The expansion enemies, on the other hand, are a little bit more interesting. The ratlings, the reptosaurians, and the troglodytes. Those come out in much bigger numbers. The reptosaurians, for instance, also, even at level 1, do damage just for being in their zone. The same thing happens with the Wandering Monsters. The Wandering Monsters in the base game are relatively powerful, but there are a lot of really cool ones in the expansions. Take, for instance, the giant Cyclops that comes in one of the expansions. Super cool looking figure, but not only that, any attack that she makes, she ignores all defense die of the hero that she's attacking, which can make her pretty deadly. So, just to mention that, because obviously with that sort of enemy, it does make situations a little swingy. You can obviously at one point be completely fine and roll a defense roll where you get hit for nothing, and there are certain enemies like that where you get hit and just die in one hit. All in all, Massive Darkness is a pretty cool system. Now, if you're willing to invest into that kind of system, you have a lot of customization options. Every expansion brings some new heroes, a new class, and in some cases, new wandering monsters. And there are a lot of them out there. Not only with those 3 enemies I talked about, the Troglodytes, Ratlings, and Reptosaurians in expansion, there are also several other expansions that just have one giant wandering monster, maybe a new hero, and a new hero class. There's also a tile expansion that adds some new tiles to make the game even a little bit more challenging just moving around the board. You have crystal and lava tiles. The lava tiles make the corridors lit up. Also, being in that corridor, you take a damage every time you end your turn there. The crystal tiles, the interiors become light, and then also just being in that tile, you either healed for 1 or you take damage and get stunned. This is another similarity that Massive Darkness has with Zombicide. There's a lot of customization options here. You can make the game very easy or really, really hard, depending on which enemies you have. But, of course, on the other hand, that requires money. There are a lot of boxes, a lot of miniatures, a lot of expansions. I can't even fit it all in one shot. Also, to bring one little negative here, the Kickstarter Exclusives. There are a few Kickstarter exclusive heroes. I wouldn't say they're all that necessary, nor is the Kickstarter exclusive class. But some of the Wandering Monsters, it would have been nice to have seen those out for retail somewhere. There's a Flesh Golem one, for instance, that heals half its health every round. There's the Unicorn Wandering Monster that gets buffed depending on if there's male or females in its line of sight. There's just a few monsters that do sort of make the game a little bit more interesting or kind of fun or just silly, that it would be nice if Cool Mini or Not would just sell a retail box of the Kickstarter exclusives. I really wouldn't mind it, and I wish more companies would kind of do it. That being said, Cool Mini or Not does tend to be a little bit cooler, where they will at least release the cards, and of course you just don't get the miniature. They're downloadable cards, of course, but nonetheless, you can at least proxy the miniature and try it out yourself. I don't know if they're going to do it with this set, but it would be pretty cool if they did. And sort of the biggest sort of negative that really did disappoint a lot of people was the campaign mode. And that's not something I was really disappointed in, because I wasn't really expecting it to be all that great. And it's really not. It's not horrible, mind you, but I think at least with the full retail core box, which comes with 10 quests, playing a full campaign of 10 quests, it just doesn't work, because you get way too powerful too soon, and then it just becomes so easy by then, because most of the monsters aren't a challenge to you, because you have every single skill, every single kind of weapon you would like at your disposal. It's just not optimal. That being said, I do think the campaign rules could work on sort of smaller scale campaigns. I did not try it with the campaign that uses the crystal and lava tiles, but that is a shorter campaign quest. I believe it's 6 quests. Could potentially work. I would think 6 quests is maybe about where a campaign would be okay. 3 quests would probably be perfect. Maybe 4 and 5 as well. I would say 6 is probably pushing it, but somewhere between 3 to 6 quests is probably where a campaign would actually shine and feel relatively challenging all the way through. And that basically sums up my review for Massive Darkness. I think it's a really cool game if this is the kind of game you're looking for. If you're looking for sort of a high fantasy, dungeon crawl-ish, but not really, where you just sort of slaughter monsters, get to feel really powerful, level up a class really quick, and finish a game in one night rather than over a series of several nights, this is a pretty good game for that. It's not your campaign-style dungeon crawler. There are campaign rules, like I said. They're just not fully fleshed out, and they require probably a little bit more customization to actually make good. On the other hand, too, it's also a system, and you have to invest in that. And if you're willing to invest in it, you can have a lot of fun with it. That's it for this review. If you really like this review, please like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you next game night. Bye.